So if you're new to photography and wondering things like, why are my photos not as sharp as I would like? Or why am I getting so much noise in my images? Or even why are my subjects looking that little bit fuzzy around the edges? Then you might be making one of these 3 mistakes with your camera settings. Hey, it's Adrienne and welcome back to another episode of the Photography Made Simple podcast and Live Snap Love YouTube channel, where I aim to give you the tools and insights to help you capture the beauty of your days through photography. Now, today I want to share with you 3 camera settings mistakes that most new photographers make. Now, I know because I made the exact same mistakes myself, and from teaching thousands of students inside Auto to Awesome, I can tell you that most new photographers make the same ones. So the chances are this is something that you are doing wrong too. Now, before we dive into these 3 mistakes and what you can do to fix them, I do want to let you know about a free download I have that I think you'll find really useful. And that is my free camera settings cheat sheet. You'll find a link to it around where you're listening to this podcast, and you can go ahead and download it, or just go to livesnaplove.com/settings and you'll be able to download it there. So let's get started with the first mistake, which is trying to keep your ISO number down. Now, the reason many people make this mistake is that with entry-level cameras, such as a Canon Rebel, when you use high ISO numbers, you tend to get more noise or grain in your images. Now, just to rewind a little bit for any new photographers here, noise or grain is that dark, speckly stuff that you get over your images, and it makes your images just look less sharp and clear, and they just have that kind of grainy, noisy look to them. And as a result, we generally go off and try and find how to avoid getting noise or grain in our images, and we hear the advice to keep our ISO number as low as possible. And then what we do is that we then get scared to use an ISO number above maybe 400. So I know that my first camera was a Canon Rebel, and I would get noise at anything over, say, ISO 400 or 800. So I made a rule that I would never go above that number. I would never use ISO 1600 or 800. I would stick at ISO 400, no matter what, even if I was shooting indoors. And the result is that my images were more noisy than ever. And what I didn't understand back then was that, yes, trying to keep your ISO number as low as possible is really important, but the key thing there is the as possible part, because you always want to get your exposure right. The last thing you want to do is underexpose your images. And that's because noise lurks in the shadows. So when you underexpose, you essentially make your entire image a shadow. And then because you've underexposed, you then have to go into editing and bring up the exposure. And then all you do is bring out the noise. So it actually makes the noise worse. So the solution to this is to use the ISO number that you need in order to get correct exposure. If you underexpose and then bring up the exposure in processing, that is going to make the noise in your image worse. So yes, try and use as low an ISO number as possible, but always make sure that you expose correctly in camera, and that will keep the noise in your images to an absolute minimum. So the second mistake you might be making is using too slow a shutter speed. So this is really common if you shoot in auto, or even if you use the semi-automatic mode like Aperture priority mode, and the camera is choosing the shutter speed for you. And when the camera does this, it tends to give you too slow a shutter speed for what you want to photograph. And that is going to lead to motion blur in your images. Now, motion blur is when you get the moving parts of your image look slightly blurred and out of focus. Now, how much depends on how slow that shutter speed is. Sometimes it can just be the slightest little fuzz around the edges, and in fact, many people mistake it for missed focus. But it's not. It's the fact that you have actually used too slow a shutter speed and you're getting that slight amount of motion blur, which is just causing all that softness around the edges. So again, it's a really simple solution here. Make sure that you're using a fast enough shutter speed for what you want to capture. And the faster the motion, the faster the shutter speed needs to be. Now, if you're not sure about what settings you should be using, then be sure to download that free camera settings cheat sheet that I mentioned earlier. You'll find a link to it around where you are listening to this podcast. But the solution to this one is to make sure that if you are shooting in auto, I would strongly encourage you to at least move to Aperture priority mode. And if you are shooting in Aperture priority mode, make sure that you keep your ISO high enough, kind of goes back to number one on this list, to make sure that you keep that shutter speed high enough for what you want to photograph. In an ideal world, I'd love for you to switch to shooting in manual mode, because that is going to give you control over your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, and make sure you can get images that look exactly the way that you want them to. Okay, let's move on now to number 3 on our list of the camera mistakes that you might be making, and that is using too wide an aperture. So this is what happened to me, and again, I know it happens to pretty much everyone, is that you buy a lens that has a maximum aperture of say f1.8, like maybe you got the 50mm f1.8 lens, and then you shoot absolutely everything at f1.8 just because you can. And maybe it's because you want to get that blurry background in your images, but you find yourself shooting at f1.8 all the time. Now, the problem with that is that the depth of field is incredibly narrow at f1.8, and you need to be extremely confident in your focusing skills in order to use that. But what often happens is that the focus lands somewhere other than where we want it to. So an example of this might be in portrait photography, where we definitely want the eyes to always be in focus. We want that to be the main focus point of our image. But then when we fail to choose our own focus point and we're not using a small enough aperture to get everything we want in focus, the focus can sometimes land here, for example, on the eyebrow or on the nose. And then what happens is you've got such a shallow depth of field that because the focus has landed on the nose, the eye is just that tiny bit soft. And it leads to that really kind of fuzzy looking and not the tack sharp images that we want. So always make sure that you use the correct aperture for the scene that you're trying to photograph. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into choosing the correct aperture and making sure that you have enough depth of field. But until you're really confident in your focusing, I would suggest that you stick to around f3.6, maybe even f2.8, and that will help you get a little bit more of the scene in focus and therefore not have any, or at least not so many, near misses where you end up getting the fringe or the eyebrow or the nose in focus. And of course, this applies to other types of photography as well, not just those of people, just where the focus lands ever so slightly out from where you wanted, but you don't have enough depth of field to get everything in focus. And you'll end up with a ton of shots that are just ever so slightly out of focus where you really wanted them to be sharp and clear. So there you have it, 3 mistakes that you might be making with your camera settings that are stopping you from getting your images looking the way that you want them to. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, then please make sure that you subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. By subscribing, you really do help us make more free content for you to enjoy. Plus, you'll be notified every time a new episode comes out, and that way you won't miss a thing. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and if you're on YouTube, for watching. And I will see you again, same time, same place next week. Bye for now.